whatever you want to do, we'll do. I just want to say before the clip, though, that, it's a sad thing coming up, for me. And, May 22nd.
Yeah.
It's over, And, you become a part of someone's life, like a habit, And every day, night, you look forward to the show. You know what they say, Johnny, you know as well as I, it's lonely at the top when there's no one on the bottom,
Good morning. It's Wednesday, Wasden Wednesday, November the 1st, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, actually it will be Spaghetti Western. There will be no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop-barron, Ayn Rand quote, my take, Maria Bartiromo, and SEAL Team 6. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Our faith in freedom does not rest on the foreseeable results in particular circumstances, but on the belief that it will, on balance, release more forces for the good than for the bad. F.A. Hayek. Human flourishing is the goal in a free and virtuous society, but utopian perfection is not. In this distinction may exist the key issue separating the most ghastly of failed economic visions from the one that has unleashed the most prosperous results in world history. An acceptance of imperfectibility is vital if we are to flourish. We cannot cut off the forces of good that can permeate far and wide for the long term, because we do not like the result in an isolated and narrow situation in the short term.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
A picture of a dog's rear end flashes on the screen. Nobody laughs. Consider our noble history. Inwardly, the entire class groans. Now comes the dry, dusty part of the lecture. One that likely will start with the ancient Greeks and make its way slowly forward into the Middle Ages sometime tomorrow. This is going to be endless. But Professor Benjamin Marcus surprises them. As I was saying to mein Freund Howard Zinn just the other day, you know, Howard, there really is only one story when you look back on it. Only one story. The story of an oppressive majority, likely installed in power through electoral or biblical chicanery. Some group that seized power unfairly, or inherited it, or simply bought it, and then has lorded it over the rest of us since then. Calls them the ancient Greeks. A small moan from the class. Or the Romans, or Hitler, or Eisenhower, or Nixon. His voice trails off, and for a moment the class thinks he's having a heart attack. Solicitously, Dave half rises. But the aged prof is all right. Forgive you me. Anyhow, you get the bild. The entire course of human history is an unbroken line of oppression, a conspiracy, a monstrous plot. You had heroic socialist movements springing up all across your country. Collectivists, spiritualists, proto-feminists, abolitionists, nudists, even the odd Mormonist. And what have you got to show for it? Al Gore in earth tones. You see, the big mistake we made in the past was imposing paternalistic hegemony. We were the daddy party, yeah? Now, at last, we realize that here in America, you don't like your daddies. Ah, but you love your mommies. So now, we must present something completely different. Fascism with mommy's face. And for this, I need your help. Suddenly, the old man sits down, near tears. It's as if his life's work is ebbing away before his eyes as he stares off into the middle distance, somewhere between Bonn and Bialystok. In a flash, Dave is by his side, consoling him and comforting him. In this moment, we can see what a natural leader Kahane is, and how much the other students admire him. He's clearly going places. Even Myrna shoots him an admiring glance. But sir, says Dave, look at all we've accomplished. We brought nudity and four-letter words into the cinema. We made the All-American Dad a figure of ridicule. We've liberated women to work 40 hours a week so we could effectively have their husband's purchasing power and yet still tax their families at a higher rate to expand government and increase the power of the state. We cut the average size of the American family practically in half, which means fewer future workers to support the Social Security system, even as the population ages and the baby boomers start to emerge from the business end of the python and bankrupt the system. In order to make up for that, we're welcoming millions and millions of undocumented workers into the Southwest over our porous southern border, where they speak openly of La Reconquista, even as we try to convince them to vote for Democrats and once in a while to pay some taxes instead of sending all their remittances home. The old man turns to look at Dave's face, shining with the same true belief that he knew so well back in the 1930s. He obviously feels better now. Danke, mein Sohn. he murmurs. You remind me of a young Bert Brecht. Danke, Kamerad, replies Gehane in perfect unaccented German. But there's so much more to fight for. Impassioned, he can feel the proud heritage of Columbia flowing through his veins. The campus unrest, the Battle of Morningside Heights, the takeover of Hamilton Hall, and the occupation of President Kirk's office in April of 1968. The other students are cheering. Myrna flashes a look at Dave that tells him he just shot to the top of the lucky list. There's so much more to destroy. We have to hold America to her highest ideals, and when she can't live up to them, take her down. We have to divide the land into warring factions of race and gender and class. We have to make blacks, women, Hispanics, everybody who's not white, look past the progress that has been made, forget that together we created modern America. We have to manipulate the electoral system, register vast numbers of fraudulent voters through seedling organizations around the country, call them acorns, unionize the public sector employees so they'll have the whip hand when dealing with the taxpayers. We have to put capitalism down and make sure it never gets up again. Except, of course, when we're trying to sell our books and movies. The class is cheering wildly now, and Dave knows how proud Che would be if he could see him now. On a roll, he continues. We have to attack the system, the government itself. Eliminate the Electoral College so that a handful of cities and their democratic machines can dominate the entire continental U.S., instead of giving a bunch of yahoos from nowhere, Nebraska, an equal say in the important issues of the day. And once we fully seize control, we have to expand the very government we just attacked, extending its reach into every aspect of people's lives, right down to... He stops for a moment, searching for the craziest, most trivial thing he can think of. They'll never believe this. Right down to which kinds of light bulbs they can use. Rejuvenated, Professor Benjamin Marcus leaps to his feet and kicks up his heels. Und why, class? Why must we do this? Why? As one, they shout, oh, don't ask why. The professor pounds the piano like the mad Claire Quilty at the end of Lolita. The class rises and begins to dance. It's a terrible and wonderful bacchanalia that lasts until, like Electra, they finally collapse exhausted on the floor. Only the professor is still standing. Amazingly, he looks at least 70 years younger than when we first saw him. So, now perhaps we may begin to see, the professor is saying, that the whiskey bar in our song is just a symbol. It stands for revolution. He nods to his TA, who fires up the PowerPoint once more. 1848. A picture of Richard Wagner flashes on the screen. 1918. Kaiser Wilhelm abdicates the throne as Russia is officially declared a Soviet republic. 1938. The Time magazine cover featuring Adolf Hitler as Man of the Year. 1968. Riots in the streets of America and Europe as Soviet tanks roll into Prague. The PowerPoint goes dark. Among the students, a realization begins to sink in. All the years end with the number 8. But, Professor, says Dave, it's already 1999. A new millennium may be about to begin, but we've missed our chance. What are we to do? The professor smiles and goes to the blackboard. He picks up a piece of chalk and writes down a number, which he conceals behind his back as he turns to his charges. Hope, he says, stepping aside, and change. Now everybody can see the date. 2008.
And that was Chapter 9 of Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 10. Radicals who manipulate language must be beaten at their own game, and then in many other venues as well, decisively, definitively, and mercilessly. After all, we strive against the powers and principalities. The retrogrades' fight involves the reclamation of the aching West from the furious clutches of devils. More importantly still, the fight is waged for the very souls of bystanders and moderates. So, use a little showmanship, make it a spectacle to behold, beat a radical in a debate, look good doing it, and then challenge him to a boxing match. The former contest wins minds, the latter wins hearts. You never know whether a listener will be converted by heart or mind first, meaning that both approaches are needful. The retrograde can afford to neglect neither. At this late hour, retrogrades need victories across multiple venues. If, for example, a smug radical talk show host challenges a square conservative senator to a public one-on-one basketball game, or vice versa, it is insufficient to the task that the senator beats the talk show host by a score of 15-14. This is actually a loss, not a victory. Consult history if the reader fails to believe it. Footnote, Ted Cruz versus Jimmy Kimmel public basketball game on June 16, 2018. End of footnote. A marginal victory in a symbolic basketball game of this sort amounts to a nullity, or worse. Will anyone remember a less than heroic victory by the senator over the mouthy talk show host? Negative. A forgettable performance is a regrettable performance because it leaves the retrograde in the same position he was in before, except he looks dogged and overwrought in the effort spent. The only true victory is a stark one, with public contests of this sort, which are the ultimate manner of demonstrating to both types of moderate that retrogrades are anything but the uninteresting, untalented, unidimensional Puritans they've taken us to be. On the contrary, retrogrades must be cultivated savages, with the motto from Braveheart, ego nunquam pronunciare mendacium, sed ego sum homo indomitus. But again, in order to prove this to anybody, you have to win. And win handsomely. In order to do that, you've got to be sitting on talent aside from book smarts. The need for landslide victories also goes for boxing matches, one of my favorite alternatives to verbal forensics. Foot races, spelling contests, chess matches, ring tosses, poker tournaments, geography bees, etc. Although it may be puerile, it is also rather classical to resolve otherwise irreconcilable ideological differences, in the public arena anyway, with some other praiseworthy and manly metric. Since the days of ancient Greeks, certain types of contest between two parties making adverse claims have proven relevant to the public. Such contests turn out to be alternative ways of showing the world, or even just radical family members back home for the holidays, the manly and virtuous merits of the retrograde worldview, the darkling genius of Christendom. Most people are readier to cede personal respect than intellectual respect. Even my liberal students are willing to listen to one of my lectures after they've seen me handle a basketball. The true retrograde is a force majeure, out to show the world the midnightly strength of the righteous man, a cultivated savage and a principled conqueror. Again, his motto is that of William Wallace, cited above, I never lie, but I am a savage. Or failing that, the retrograde may just be the principled mentor to a conqueror, in the case of the teacher of Alexander the Great and student of Plato, Aristotle. Aristotle is the Mac Daddy and godfather of all polymath retrogrades, whose many Western civilization forging fields of experience include physics, metaphysics, poetry, theater, music, logic, rhetoric, politics, ethics, biology, and zoology. The men of 76, America's retrograde revolutionary founders, needed to be comprised largely of polymaths for the simple reason that backward-looking revolutionaries require loyal throngs of followers, necessitating charismatic chieftains, men of many parts and maestros of multiple simultaneous talents. American retrograde Thomas Jefferson, a polyglot, fluent in Greek, Latin, French, Spanish, Italian, and German, was also a polymath. Quote, agriculturalist, anthropologist, architect, astronomer, bibliophile, botanist, classicist, diplomat, educator, ethnologist, farmer, geographer, gourmet, horseman, horticulturist, inventor, lawyer, lexicographer, linguist, mathematician, meteorologist, musician, naturalist, numismatist, paleontologist, philosopher, political philosopher, scientist, statesman, violinist, writer, unquote. Footnote. That was from jeffersonia.wordpress.com. It takes this sort of multi-venue genius to take down a statist empire. The greater the retrogrades task at hand, the more needful of polymathic genius. And in 2019, restoring America to her former wisdom and beauty requires as many moral, intellectual, physical geniuses as can be mustered from among our ranks. There's no time for sitting passively on the couch. Retrogrades, to your training stations.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, Rule 10, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
And shared with them that I believe we are a movement in a generational transition. On one hand, there is the Reagan generation, and my generation on the other. The Reagan generation sees how much freedom and liberty has been lost since Reagan, and is trying to do whatever they can to hold on to whatever is left before it's completely lost. The hope is that if we hold on long enough and defeat Democrats with any, and by any we sadly mean any, Republican, we can create another perfect storm. And it will be morning in America again. But my generation doesn't have that nostalgia for the Reagan era because we were growing up and not really paying attention or weren't even born at all. Now that we are paying attention, we don't see the country in the context of what has been lost, but rather how much ground needs to be gained. We are not seeing this purely in the context of the next election cycle. We're seeing this in a generational cycle, which is why we oppose compromises on important issues like life and the debt ceiling. We don't really care what the ruling class and its brigade of hand-wringers masquerading as pundits and pollsters think, because we're the ones that will pick up the long-term tab for the financial, moral, and spiritual brokenness of the country long after they're all 6 feet under. We're looking at the next 40 years, not just the next 4. Ironically, though we may not be a part of the Reagan generation, we have the same perspective Reagan had in 1976, when he said the Republican Party ought to stand for something other than becoming more like Democrats. And there should be no more pale pastels, but bold colors instead. Eventually, my generation is going to get its chance to lead because we have time on our side. Nobody lives forever. When we do get our chance to lead, and it may be sooner rather than later, we need to learn the lessons of recent failures, lest we fail our children and grandchildren. This election provided plenty of those hard lessons, but also a useful roadmap on how to win the future. Number 1, the truth still sets us free. Yes, the mainstream media favors liberals, but just giving our yin to their yang doesn't produce truth. It just produces another echo chamber. I couldn't believe how many conservatives I know and trust who really thought Romney was going to win, and win convincingly, despite the fact several polling models with a 96% accuracy rate in the past 2 presidential elections said otherwise. Our version of propaganda is no truer than their version of propaganda. I say this in love, but brothers and sisters, some of our brethren are dangerously close to becoming the magically thinking, virtual reality living creatures we accuse the Democrat base of being. If we want to advance truth, we need to believe the truth ourselves, even when it's inconvenient. And the truth is, we are no longer the dominant view in the culture, and we have some work to do to change that. Point number 2, hypocrisy doesn't sell. Pollster Scott Rasmussen once told me the single most unpopular piece of legislation in American history was the, in my opinion, criminal TARP bailout of 2008. Yet we nominated a candidate who was for it in the next presidential election. Good luck going to Toledo and telling Ohioans making $15 an hour who think their job was saved by the auto industry bailout that they didn't deserve a government handout, but Merrill Lynch and Goldman Sachs did. Sometimes we just write the Democrats' commercials for them. Point number 3, cast a vision. After the Democrats lost an election in 2004 they probably shouldn't have lost, the more principled progressive wing of the party took over. The result was an anti-Bush liberal uprising in 2006, similar to the anti-Obama Tea Party uprising of 2010. Next, the new progressives defeated the more pragmatic Clintons head-to-head in a presidential primary. Obama ran for president, promising his base he would move the ball down the field for them with their crown jewel legislation, Obamacare. He then went right back to that base in 2012 and worked the exact same get-out-the-vote model that worked in 2008. He embraced his base, even on social issues, both in the White House and at his convention. While we were scoffing at him for never moderating, Obama was energizing his base all along in preparation for a tough re-election. The progressives cast a vision that took more than one election cycle. They followed it through, and then they won. They never detoured, no matter what the facts were on the ground, because they have a courage of their conviction that their vision is what's best for the country. They wanted to win to govern. The Republican ruling class wants to govern to win. The Democrats want to run a country. The Republican ruling class wants to run a party. Point 4, stop demonizing our neighbors. You know, we called Bill Clinton every name in the book and even impeached him. That didn't work. We called Obama every name in the book. Some of them were even true. And all we did was help him to portray his failures as Bush's fault and energize his base all the more. We called Sandra Fluck a slut. And all we did was scare even more skittish advertisers away from conservative talk radio. Yes, there is a double standard here. You should see some of the tweets I received after appearing on MSNBC, like when someone tweeted he hoped my daughters would get raped after I defended former U.S. Senate candidate Richard Murdoch. We watch homosexual activists glitter bomb conservatives and can only imagine what would happen if we returned such fire. It's not fair, but it is what it is. I am as fiery as the next guy, and at times I've not been able to hold my tongue, especially when it's fun not to. But I've learned that while we don't need to moderate our principles, we do need to temper our approach. Ann Coulter's shrillness may sell books to the already converted, but it's losing the culture at large. Yes, the entire Sandra Fluck controversy was a phony, liberal media meme devised to minimize the influence of Limbaugh, the godfather of conservative media. But that proves my point. While we have focused on political results, the left has focused on changing culture. Culture is the mouth of a civilization's river. Politics is what occurs downstream. We wait to battle them on the political level, but by then it's too late because they have already coordinated their assets in media, pop culture, and technology to create the perception of a narrative. Whether it's phony or not is irrelevant because the media is the message. As Lenin once famously said, repeat a lie often enough and it becomes the truth. As a result of surrendering culture to the left, we no longer have a country that accepts many of our premises. Thus, we have to go into, pardon the phrase, evangelism mode. That requires a relationship and trust, and it's hard to build that rapport with people while demonizing them. Pardon the cliche, but we need happy warriors. As D.L. Moody once said, when you're winsome, you win some. Most of our neighbors we are angry with for voting the way they did don't go to church. Most of them were taught things about this country in government, no longer public, schools that are contrary to this nation's actual history. How should we expect them to vote given those circumstances? Nobody can rise above their own worldview. People can only act on that which they believe to be true. Since the 1960s, we have surrendered academia and pop culture to statists and social Darwinists, with nary a shot fired. What did we think would be the generational result of that abrogation? We're not a silent majority anymore. We're a dwindling plurality in clear and present danger of becoming a silenced minority. If you want your neighbors to vote differently, then we have to change their worldview. Number 5, We need solutions, not just values. Obama won young voters again, despite the fact they're the group hardest hit by his policies. They will be saddled with all the debt we're tacking on and live in a more dangerous world in the long run with the emergence of the Arab Spring, the Muslim Brotherhood, and eventually a nuclear Iran. We are losing them by trying to win them over to values that make freedom possible. Judeo-Christian morality, personal responsibility, limited government, etc. Yet they have been educated in an environment that makes these values foreign to them. It only will get harder to win them over as they get older. For example, they have not been taught the Second Amendment is required for keeping individual freedom secure from government tyranny, but rather gun control as a means of stopping little children from being killed by gang violence or gun accidents. See, they're not looking for values, they're looking for solutions. For better or for worse, there is one Republican who has been attracting younger voters in the past two presidential primaries, and that was Ron Paul. Granted, some are young people whose only goal seems to be legalizing marijuana, but that's also a lazy stereotype on the part of too many of my fellow conservatives. Many of them are critically thinking young people who don't understand why it's their responsibility to pay for the lack of fiscal and moral discipline of their forefathers, and why they have to die in foreign lands, nation building, when our nation is declining here. Dr. Paul offered them solutions to these problems and not just values. Now, I don't agree with all of Dr. Paul's solutions, but I do think we could learn from his approach. Do we have a solution for these young voters to their problems? Furthermore, do we have solutions to the problems of healthcare and job creation?
And that was in the next part of Chapter 2 for Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Think of Franklin Roosevelt, the young Roosevelt, from this distinguished political family. And then he begins this glittering political career as a young man. He's Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and everyone's predicting, governor and a president. It just seemed the most natural path for this brilliant young man that charmed everybody he ever met. Then, polio and paralysis. And Roosevelt, by all accounts, fell into years, even decades-long depression, self-pity, a sense of fruitlessness and hopelessness. His mother largely encouraged him just to retire. But what made him the great figure that he was? Yeah, to a degree, his positive qualities, he kept those all his life, but the compassion that was born of his struggle with the thorn in the flesh. Where you stumble, that's where you dig for treasure. The Lord says, my grace is sufficient for you, because in your weakness, my power reaches perfection. Think of Franklin Roosevelt.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Ayn Rand quote of the day. Quote, the next time you hear about a crazed gang of juvenile delinquents, don't look for such explanations as slum childhood, economic underprivilege, or parental neglect. Look at the moral atmosphere of the country, at the example set by their elders and by their public leaders. Unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Stuart Varney's My Take.
There is a profound split in the Democrat Party. It will be felt in next year's election. Last week, a resolution condemning Hamas was opposed by 15 Democrats. They could not bring themselves to condemn the October 7th atrocities. Josh Gottheimer, he's a New Jersey Democrat, said the 15 were despicable, his word. Andre Carson, a Democrat and squad member, promptly called Gottheimer a coward and suggested they step outside to settle it. Now, that is a split. Another example.
At a press conference, Democrat Congresswoman Ilhan Omar shouted at New York Democrat Richie Torres, "How many more Palestinians would make you happy if they died?" Torres, Democrat, responded, calling Omar's charge a vicious lie. Illinois Democrat Brad Schneider called out Democrat Rashida Tlaib for continuing to push anti-Israel propaganda that's been picked up all around the world. Schneider says he is incredibly disappointed. The Hamas lobby, if I may call them that, has split the party. In a Wall Street Journal poll, only 48% of Democrats believe the U.S. has a responsibility to support Israel. Only 48%. The split is hurting Biden. A Gallup poll showed his approval rating among Democrats had dropped 11 points in a month, and his approval overall dropped to a low of just 37%. He is losing ground among young people and minorities, key constituents for the election 1 year from now. In other words, the party's divisions restrict the president's policy options and his public statements. The Hamas lobby will divide this party for years. Second hour of Varney just getting started.
So this time he spent no time making any conclusions, drawing any conclusions. He said nothing about what could or should happen. He doesn't say, is this what should happen to the Democrat Party? Should they be split? As far as the president's concerned and his ratings, should they be down? And what should the president do to get his ratings back up? What should the Democrat Party do to resolve this split? Also, where does America stand on this in terms of, is the split good or bad for the United States of America as a whole? And if it's bad for America, then what should happen? What should we do? What should rank and file people, voters, do about this, if anything? So all those questions remain to be answered because he couldn't be bothered. Back in a minute. Thank you. So listening to Maria Bartiromo, she was interviewing a senator, and she asked this senator about what it is that the Republicans are doing or not doing in the Senate, what they're getting accomplished or not getting accomplished. And of course, he falls back and says, well, we don't run the Senate. That's run by Chuck Schumer. Now, where she failed was to ask him the question, why? Why don't you run the Senate? What's wrong with you? Why is it more important to you to stick your thumb in the eye of Donald Trump than it is to have a majority in the Senate and a big majority in the House? That's the question she should have asked. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, SEAL Team 6.
11. Capturing Aidid's evil genius. September 12th, 1993. Casanova and I walked into the hangar, beard and hair still growing out. I didn't get a haircut the whole time I was in Mogadishu. In the hangar, everyone seemed happy to see us. They knew we'd been living for nearly 15 days in booger eater territory, and they'd heard rumors about some of the work we'd done. Several rangers approached us. Wish you guys would have been with us when we were ambushed. Others wanted to ask, what have you guys been doing? We lived with Delta Force, the Combat Control Team, CCT, and Pararescuemen, PJs. CCTs were the Air Force's Special Operations Pathfinders who could parachute into an area and provide reconnaissance, air traffic control, fire support, and command, control, and communications on the ground. Particularly helpful to us in calling down death from above. SIGINT drafted many of their people from the CCTs. The Air Force PJs, also Special Operations, focused on rescuing pilots downed in enemy territory and administering medical treatment. Both Delta and SEAL Team 6 had begun augmenting their forces with CCTs and PJs. On a SEAL Team 6 boat crew of 8 men assaulting a building, the addition of a PJ, who could take care of patching up bullet wounds, freed up a SEAL hospital corpsman to kick more doors. Likewise, the addition of a CCT carrying a radio on his back and calling for air support freed up a SEAL radio man to carry other mission-essential gear on his back and help with the door kicking. Although the Air Force CCTs and PJs were not as specialized in skills like door kicking, they were experts in their fields, to a higher level than SEAL or Delta operators. Integrating them into SEAL Team 6 and Delta was one of the best moves JSOC ever made. Although not held to as high a tactical standards such as physical fitness remain the same as SEALs, particularly for close quarters combat training, they received Team 6's Green Team training. During my Green Team, although a CCT and a PJ were among the 4 or 5 who failed, a CCT and a PJ passed. The CCTs and PJs also rotated over to Delta Force for their training. Then, after some time at home with their Air Force units, they rotated back and forth between 6 and Delta again. In the hangar, the 4 of us SEALs mostly hung out with CCTs and PJs because we knew them from training together in Dam Neck, Virginia. Like most of Delta, they had high and tight haircuts to blend in with the Rangers, but the pale skin on their scalps gave them away. One of our CCTs was Jeff, a pretty boy who was a woman magnet like Casanova. They even hung around together sometimes. Another CCT was Dan Schilling, a 30-year-old laid-back Southern Californian. Dan left the Army Reserves to become a CCT. In the middle of the hangar, when we played cards on the fold-up planning table, Dan often gave me a cigar. He liked to smoke Royal Jamaica Maduros. Tim Wilkinson quit his electrical engineering job for the adventure of becoming a PJ. Scotty served as the PJ's team leader. Near the Air Force planning table in the middle of the hangar, the CCTs and PJs set a blow-up doll named Gina the Love Goddess on a chair with a sign around her neck advertising services and prices. She was a birthday gift from Dan Schilling's wife and Jeff's girlfriend for one of the Air Force guys who never got mail and didn't have a girlfriend. After a congressional visit, Gina disappeared. No sense of humor. The Rangers outnumbered everyone, but they remained cautious about crossing the imaginary line, like a wall that reached the ceiling into our area. Maybe we had a mystique that they respected, or a body odor. Whatever the reason, they gave us our space. A lot of the Delta guys seemed to have the attitude, if you aren't Delta, we don't want anything to do with you. We probably had some of the same attitude, but there were only 4 of us. If we'd had all of Red Team, we might have been more arrogant. Being the only 4 SEALs in Africa, we had to hang out with somebody. Around the hangar, we wore shorts, T-shirts, and Teva flip-flops. When we wore military uniforms, we didn't wear names or rank insignia. Military rank held less meaning for us than it did for Rangers and the conventional military. In the teams, we often followed leaders because of reputations they earned or a certain skill set they possessed. Unlike the conventional military, our enlisted men usually called officers by their first names or nicknames. We didn't subscribe to the robot-like military mentality of top-down leadership either. Just because a person outranks someone else in the teams doesn't mean he'll be leading anything other than on paper. We adapted our weapons and tactics to changing environments and situations. At 2100, we received mortar fire, now becoming such a regular occurrence that guys in the hangar cheered. Some had a mortar pool going. A person could buy a time slot for $1. Whoever chose the slot closest to the actual time the mortar hit won the pool. No one had leads on ID'd. September 13th, 1993. The next day, true to form, although he was the senior SEAL, Sourpuss didn't initiate much of anything and didn't exert control. He was content to sit around and write his wife letters. Little Big Man checked into using QRF helicopters as sniper platforms. We were also encouraged to go out on patrol with the Rangers when we didn't have anything else going on. A Pakistani convoy came in to resupply. Under General Garrison's orders, Casanova and I rode with Steve, a Delta sniper working a lot with military intelligence, Commander Assad, and Assad's Pakistani troops. We drove across town to the northwest, near Pakistani Stadium, where the Pakistanis ran a tight compound. Their troops exhibited excellent military bearing and a by-the-book attitude. They kept the area tidy. Nothing like the sloppy Italians who were constantly trying to undermine us. During the night, Aidid's militia fired on one of our helicopters, and they used the abandoned Somali National University as their sniper hide. Casanova and I climbed 6 stories to the top of a tower. From there, we could see the house of Osman Ali Atto, Aidid's financier and evil genius. Atto allegedly used income from drug trafficking, mostly khat, arms trafficking, looting, and kidnapping, to buy more weapons and support for Aidid's militia. Next to Atto's house stood his vehicle repair garage, an enormous open-top concrete building where his mechanics worked on cars, bulldozers, and technicals, pickup trucks with 50 caliber machine guns on tripods bolted onto the truck bed. This was the same garage where Aidid had held the rally to pump up his militia while we were in Pasha. If we capture Atto, we cut off the financial support for Aidid's militia. He who controls the purse strings controls the war. Nothing significant happened at Atto's house except that the porch light flickered on and off 3 times. Probably some kind of signal, but we didn't see any movement in the house. It was only a matter of time before we captured Atto. September 14th, 1993. We continued to observe Atto's garage. People constantly came and went. 3 mechanics worked on vehicles. Casanova and I spotted someone who looked like Atto, flashing a big white smile, having a meeting. We took a picture, then transmitted the data via secure link back to the intel guys so they could make sure the man in the garage really was Atto. We lost him when he left the garage and drove away. The same day, a ranger thought he spotted Aidid in a convoy. Delta hit a building to find out they had captured General Ahmed Jalal instead, even though Jalal was much taller, heavier, and lighter skinned than Aidid, and was a close ally of the United Nations. Aidid had become like Elvis. People saw him where he wasn't. At night, the Pakistani compound received fire from the area of nearby trees and buildings. Commander Assad said, "We keep receiving fire from there on a regular basis. Can you help us?" "We can spot them with our infrared scopes and fire tracers at them, and your machine gunners can open fire on that area. The tracers are phosphorus-covered rounds that burn with a glow." Allah was with those militiamen. They didn't fire again that evening. September 16th, 1993. 2 days later, 3 women entered Atto's house, and 2 left. 1 man also entered. Another meeting was held, including 1 person who appeared to be Atto, grinning with those pearly whites. He seemed in charge, directing people what to do. Casanova came down from the tower in the Pakistani compound and moved closer to the retaining wall facing Atto's compound. Casanova noticed that people were entering a house near the garage rather than directly entering Atto's house. We called the QRF to launch a mortar strike, but the 3 mortars landed nowhere near it. Later, we exfiltrated back to the hangar at the Army compound. There, we debriefed with the Delta captain. During the brief, I said, "We don't mind patrolling with the Rangers, but we'd rather drive ourselves. We know what we'll do when we come under fire, but we don't know what they'll do." The captain approved. Also, we'd like to do night sniper flights with the QRF, eyes over Mogadishu. Okay. Casanova and I took a trip to the CIA trailer and shared intelligence about Osman Atto with them. The first time Casanova and I rode in a QRF helo, we found out their rules of engagement allowed them to keep a magazine in their weapon, but no round in the chamber until an enemy fired at them. We always kept a round in our chamber, so all we had to do was flick off the safety switch and shoot. In a war zone, the QRF's rules of engagement were ludicrous. One day, Casanova and I boarded a Humvee with the QRF. I said, "Lock and load." The soldiers gave me a strange look. What the? Gradually, the light bulbs came on. Each man made sure his weapon was still on safe and loaded a round in the chamber. Casanova and I would take responsibility for any repercussions from the Army brass. The next time some Rangers, Casanova and I drove up in our Humvees at the QRF compound, the QRF soldiers who had ridden with Casanova and me before hurried to ride with us again because they knew what our first command would be. Lock and load. Later, as more soldiers had an opportunity to ride with us, they'd be standing in line waiting to see which of the Humvees Casanova and I drove up in. We laughed at the sight of them fighting to see who would ride in our vehicle. At 2400, we boarded a Gila with the QRF, both of us sitting on one side of the aircraft. Lock and load. The two QRF snipers sitting on the other side of the bird, locked and loaded. Our flight crew used to wait until being fired upon to return fire, but they had taken small arms fire and 2 RPGs the night before. Shoot anyone you feel threatened by. If anyone aimed at us or took an aggressive stance or positioned themselves to take a shot at us, then we could fire at them. Although the daytime temperatures averaged 89 degrees Fahrenheit, nights cooled off to around 59 degrees. During our flight over Mogadishu, campfires burned in the upper stories of abandoned buildings. I could imagine refugees gathered around them to keep warm. 2 Somalis on the ground pointed their weapons up at us. Casanova aimed his car-15 at one of them. He squeezed the trigger, capping the Somali. The buddy took off running between some buildings, and our pilot couldn't get us near him. That same night, a Delta operator with a car-15 shot a Somali 3 times in the chest, one of Aidid's lieutenants. Unfortunately, Delta also had their second accidental discharge, AD. An operator from one of the best fighting units on the planet accidentally fired his weapon in the hangar. He could have killed someone. I remember seeing the look on the operator's face afterward. He knew what was coming. Garrison and others were irate. Even though the operator had trained most of his career to put his gun in a fight, now he had to pack up his gun and leave. His military record would suffer too. Whether Delta Force or SEAL Team 6, an AD meant a quick trip back to the States. Although we could endure physical pain and suffering, being ostracized from the group was often the heaviest punishment.
And that was part 1 of Chapter 11, Capturing Aidid's Evil Genius, from SEAL Team 6. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.